Many of these extraordinary megalithic sites around the world were built in the age before the flood. The ancient Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans and all the rest of them, they believe that the very same thing occurred.
I don't even know if people are going to believe me when I say this. When you started talking about the aliens and the antimatter, all the lights went off. They have a $4,000 confidence monitor. It like fizzed, like the picture got all crazy.
Maybe somebody's signaling to us to shut up.
You wrote a very popular book, Birthright, about ancient civilizations, archaeology. You're an explorer, you're a researcher, you look like Indiana Jones, you've lived in Peru for a decade. You wrote this very popular book about how there are some gaps in scholarly archaeology, ancient history, things that you're not allowed to talk about in the academy, that scholars write off, that you think are worth exploring. It's done very well, and your view is that the Bible is actually a good guide to understanding the ancient past, which I guess distinguishes you from other people who are revisionist on ancient history and archaeology.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's accurate. So I come from a biblical paradigm. That's my worldview. And it's not because I've been indoctrinated into Christianity. It's because I've been entirely convinced that the gospel of Christ is true. So that's my perspective. I believe that the biblical narrative is an accurate account. Now, that doesn't mean I'm a literalist in every detail, but I think that it's the most remarkable book ever compiled for many reasons. And it does happen to be, in my opinion, very accurate and enlightening about the past, even the deep past, the distant past, the antediluvian world. And so I've traveled all around the world and have investigated. I investigate, I guess you could describe it as fringe topics. So I don't have a background in academia. I don't have a doctorate in anything, but I've spent a lot of years in, let's say, Central America, South America, studying megaliths, studying lost civilizations. And really what I would say the moment that convinced me that we're missing large portions of our historic past, of the deep past, I'm talking about the antediluvian past, the pre-flood past, is when I stood in front of the megaliths for the first time in Cusco, in the city of Cusco, and especially the megalithic complex of Sacsayhuaman, which is in Cusco, and it is one of the most magnificent stone structures on Earth. The walls are mammoth. They're made of polygonal stones that are fitted together so precisely that you cannot slip a butter knife between the joints. And they're beveled, so they have this pillowed appearance. And some of these stones, the foundation stones, weigh in excess of 250 to 300 tons. And they were quarried some 10 to 20 miles away. And it was standing in front of the walls of Sacsayhuaman that really, because you can read things in books and you can theorize about lost civilizations and ancient technology, but when you stand in front of megalithic walls, there's something so convincing about that in relationship to the idea that we're missing something.
So then
we don't have the whole story.
What distinguishes specifically your view of the ancient past with the popularly held view in the academy? I've never been to Sacsayhuaman, I've never been invited. But if I did go down there, I wouldn't even know how to distinguish what the scholarly crew thinks about it and what maybe the more fringe theorists think about it.
In regard to the megaliths in Peru, there's many megalithic sites in Peru. The academic consensus is that most of these sites, especially the ones around Cusco, also Ollantaytambo, Machu Picchu, were constructed by the Inca. And the Inca were an extraordinary empire. This was an extraordinary civilization. They were able to do many things that other pre-Columbian cultures could not achieve. In many ways, they were like the Romans of South America. They built amazing roads and aqueducts. And so I have a lot of respect for the Inca civilization, but they did not build the megaliths.
Because the Inca, while old, aren't that old.
No, they're not that old. So I believe that the Inca discovered these megalithic sites, Machu Picchu, certainly Sacsayhuaman, and they decided to inhabit them and rebuild them because the Inca viewed themselves as the offspring of the gods. They were the children of the sun. And when you talk about the Inca does not describe the totality of the culture, of the civilization. The Inca was a very specific, a very particular bloodline within that civilization. It was the royal bloodline. Only they were the Inca. The Spanish called them the orejones because they had the large discs in their ears. They had the large earlobes.
Like my barista at Starbucks. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And so this culture, within this culture, the Inca culture, you have this royal bloodline, as I said, who considered themselves to be the offspring of the gods. And so when they came upon the megalithic ruins, the remains of what they could only interpret as the works of the gods. I mean, we're talking about massive stones that are, as I said, cut with such precision that they're fitted together without the use of mortar. And archaeologists refer to this style of building, this style of masonry, as cyclopean masonry. And you find it all over the earth, especially as it pertains to megaliths, because obviously Peru isn't the only place on the planet with megaliths. But this architecture, cyclopean architecture, where they have these massive stones exquisitely cut and dressed and then fit together without the use of mortar, I believe that is the signature of an ancient advanced civilization that was annihilated from the face of the earth in the deep past.
What time are we talking about? How deep is it?
We're talking 10,000 plus years ago.
Okay. So the scholarly consensus view is that human civilization arose within the last, 5,000 years?
Yeah.
And you're saying, no, there was this to our understanding, human civilization that built all this stuff. So then the question, of course, is who were they and where did they go? And why do you think this? I mean, why couldn't the Inca have done it?
Well, let me address that first. We know that the Inca didn't build the walls of Sacsayhuaman. Now, you won't read this in any history books, and you won't hear archaeologists saying this. But my friend and colleague Anselm P. Rambla, he's a Spanish explorer and researcher, and he actually excavated at the walls of Sacsayhuaman, the walls I was referring to earlier, those magnificent megalithic walls. He got permission from the Ministry of Culture in Peru to conduct an excavation in the site, generally in various areas of Sacsayhuaman. And he dug down to the foundation stones of Sacsayhuaman, to the lower levels. Yeah. And what he discovered at the lower levels were pre-Incan artifacts, and only pre-Incan artifacts.
How do you know? What distinguishes a pre-Incan artifact?
Well, I mean, there's artifacts that archaeologists can identify as Inca, and then artifacts that belong to cultures that pre-existed the Inca or that were conquered by the Inca.
So the kind of artifact that you wouldn't have found at a higher level, I guess.
Precisely right. Okay. So he's digging deep down into the soil there in front of Sacsayhuaman, and he's finding only pre-Incan artifacts. This is definitive evidence that those walls pre-exist the Inca. They were there before the Inca discovered them. In fact, we talked about Sacsayhuaman also being a megalithic site. Most people don't realize that Machu Picchu is also a megalithic site. And Machu Picchu is extraordinary. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world that I've ever seen. I mean, certainly in terms of archaeological remains, Machu Picchu is phenomenal. Most people don't realize that the foundations of Machu Picchu are megalithic. And they have the same sort of polygonal, cyclopean architecture as you see in Cusco. And the Inca, I believe, discovered these ruins, and seeing themselves as the offspring of the gods, they concluded that it was their birthright to inhabit what was once the habitation of the gods and rebuild their monuments. And everywhere you go in Peru, and I would say all around the world, people have made use, obviously, of these magnificent megalithic foundations and have built with inferior techniques on top of them. And this is evident in Machu Picchu. This is certainly evident in Machu Picchu. In fact, Machu Picchu, the Quechua, the real name for Machu Picchu is Ijampu. And what does Ijampu mean? The abode of the gods, the dwelling of the gods.
So if this is so evident in Machu Picchu, why don't any of the people at Harvard agree that this is a megalithic pre-modern notions of ancient history structure? Because
they're worried about their careers. They're worried about the esteem of their colleagues. They're worried about being published in the prestigious magazines and having a future in their field. And they would be ostracized. I mean, if you talk about let's put it this way. When I was at I've been to Machu Picchu numerous occasions. And there was this particular time, I was actually with my colleague Anselm P. Rommel at the time, and there was a guide, and he was very, very, very knowledgeable. He was an old guide. He's been a guide there for decades, and the guides are very well trained in the conventional narrative of the Inca and especially of Machu Picchu.
Yeah.
And we were quizzing him on certain aspects of the architecture at Machu Picchu. For example, you can look across the courtyard at Machu Picchu and you'll see a wall, a megalithic wall with polygonal stones, which means they're stones that have all different kinds of angles in them. Some of these stones have a dozen angles in them, and they're fit precisely to the other stones around them. And they're anti-seismic, by the way. But then right on top of them, you would have this inferior stonework. And some of that, much of that is archaeological reconstruction, but some of it we know was the Inca did it. They built on top. And I asked him, I said, that wall there, very clearly, the lower levels are superior to the higher levels. You were looking at two different techniques of masonry, of architecture, one superior, one inferior. How do you explain that if the Inca built that? Why would they start off with this superior technique and then gradually the technique becomes inferior? Why would they do that? What's the explanation? What is the conventional explanation? And he thought about it for a moment and he said, because that's the way they like to do it. That was the answer. Because that's the way they like
they did
to do it. Exactly.
Because they did.
And I said, well, how is that rational? How can you logically deduce this? Yeah. I mean, honestly, that they did this just because that's the way they like to do it, or they like the way it looked. I said, you're a smart guy. You're well trained in academia, and they are, all of the guides up there at Machu Picchu. I said, there's no way you actually believe that. Yeah. And he conceded to us, yeah, you're right. That's ludicrous. Huh. It really is ludicrous. And so what are we looking at? The megaliths around the world, not just in Peru. We're talking about the ones in Peru here, but they're all over the world. Baalbek, for example, is one of the most magnificent. I mean, you have...
Baalbek?
Baalbek is a megalithic site in Lebanon. Okay. It's one of the most magnificent megalithic sites on Earth. Huge stones that weigh thousands of tons. And, of course, the conventional explanation is that the Romans built it. And indeed, they raised a temple to Jupiter there on that site. But just like the Inca discovered the megaliths and determined that they were going to build on top of them and rebuild the abode of the gods, so I believe the Romans and cultures that predate the Romans did the same thing. Of course you're going to use the megalithic foundations. See, the megaliths, it's not just exquisite architecture, it's not just exquisite masonry. They're anti-seismic.
Okay.
They're built in such a way that they don't collapse during earthquakes. Right. And I'll go back to Cusco here because Cusco's a perfect example of this. When the Spaniards invaded and conquered the city of Cusco, they began to disassemble the higher levels of Sacsayhuaman because it starts off with large foundational stones and the stones gradually get smaller as they ascend to the top of the structure. And so they took all of the stones that they could manage and carry away, and they built their cathedrals. And the Spanish were no slouches at building cathedrals, okay? The Spaniards had amazing architects, and they knew what they were doing. And they built their cathedrals in the city of Cusco on top of the ruins of the Incan temples that they demolished. And they built their cathedrals, and every time there's a major earthquake, the cathedrals fall. But you know what doesn't fall? Those megalithic walls that I believe have been standing there for thousands of years.
Is one explanation as to why the craftsmanship gets shoddier toward the top, just that it's harder to build stuff the higher up you go? Is that, I don't know, what do I know? I don't know anything about architecture.
No, if you look at some of these walls, you'll notice that there's this exquisite architecture. There's this impressive, superior masonry, and then you'll find gaps in that masonry where obviously something happened and they had to replace the original stone, and they replaced it with a totally different inferior technique and inferior stonework. And it's evident. For example, we'll go back to Peru for a minute. You go to this megalithic site called Ollantaytambo. Ollantaytambo is a fascinating site because in Peru you're going to find two different techniques for megalith building. One of the techniques is the polygonal, what's known as the beveled polygonal, cyclopean walls. But then you're going to find, and this other technique you find in Bolivia as well, it's the interlocking, the interlocking blocks. In this method, they would actually, it was like Legos. They would actually cut out let's say a rectangular shape inside of the block, and then they would fit it on top of a rectangular shape protruding from the block below it. It would interlock like a Lego. And in Ollantaytambo, you find both of these techniques together. You find the polygono and the interlocking. And what's unique about Ollantaytambo is that this megalithic complex was in the process of being built. You can see it. The stones are being dressed, and they're making their way up the side of the mountain where the complex crescendos in this temple structure called the Temple of the Sun at the top, very large stones in excess of probably somewhere around 80 to 100 tons. And you can see the blocks making their way up, and they're being dressed, and they're huge megalithic blocks. And there's even one particular block where it appears as if somebody was cutting into it with like a circular saw. I mean, you can see the cut mark right through the block.
Yeah.
And it just stopped. It halted. The construction came to an abrupt halt. And now the conventional explanation is that the halt was because the Spaniards had arrived, and the Inca were in the process of building another temple. The Spaniards arrived, so they stopped the work, and they had to combat the Spanish. In fact, they fought the only battle the Inca really won against the Spaniards was one right there at Sacsayhuaman, because they were able to flood the valley. It's an amazing story. It really is an incredible story. But they didn't build those walls. I'm absolutely persuaded that the Inca did not build those walls. And furthermore, many of these megaliths around the world, including at Ollantaytambo, are specifically aligned to particular cosmological phenomena. And you can date the monument with the stars.
Right.
This is called archaeoastronomy. And I have a good friend in Cusco, his name is Andres Adasme. He's an archaeoastronomer. And he figured out at Ollantaytambo that the dating was based on a solar alignment, and it's very complex. But he dates it to around 10,000 BC. Well, he also did the same thing with the city of Cusco, and that's based on some particular solar phenomenon revolving around the three most important celestial objects for the Andean community, which is the Milky Way, the winter solstice, and the Southern Cross. Those are the three primary celestial markers for the Andean people. And based on those markers, you can reverse the clock with programs such as Stellarium, and you can see if there are any celestial events, if the precession of the equinox and all kinds of different things, if there's a lock, if it can lock in other words, if you can find a pattern.
Right.
And he did in the city of Cusco, and the date was 10,000 BC. And I'm using Peru as an example to illustrate a larger point here. It's the same all over the world as it pertains to megaliths.
Okay, so if the construction didn't stop because the Spaniards arrived, as the conventional explanation goes, why did it stop? And who are these people 10,000 years ago?
The construction came to an abrupt halt because the earth was subjected to cataclysm.
Okay.
A massive...
Like a global flood, for instance?
Like a global flood. But it wasn't just a flood. It was a cataclysm, the destructive potential of which we can scarcely imagine. So, and I believe that to some extent, some of these megaliths were being built in anticipation of cataclysm, like they knew it was coming. And so they were building these massive megalithic edifices in the hope to survive it. And that's my own personal theory.
So how would they have known it was coming?
Well, that's very complex. That's based on the precession of the equinox. It's based on the zodiac. The transition of the aeons is cataclysmic. The ancients knew this. That's the purpose of the zodiac. That's the purpose of many of these megalithic sites and other monuments around the world, because the ancients knew. I will say that the ancients believed, and when we say the ancients, we're talking about the ancient Near Eastern cultures, the Mesopotamians, the ancient Hebrews, the Egyptians, and then you have, of course, the ancient Greeks and the Romans, and then other cultures around the world, like the Inca, like the Maya in Central and South America. They believed that the earth was subject to cyclic cataclysm. that every so many thousands of years, something happened, and it would precipitate cataclysm on planet Earth. And we're talking about civilization-ending cataclysm. And yes, the Great Flood of biblical fame is one such cataclysm, probably the greatest cataclysm in living memory. And all of these ancient cultures around the world have a ubiquitous testimony of cataclysm. I mean, this is the testimony of our ancestors. Yeah. And it's ubiquitous in every culture. You can find the mythologies, the legends of the Great Flood and of other kinds of cataclysms that annihilated the population of the earth, and there was only a handful of survivors. And yet, archaeologists and historians and the conventional narrative of history totally disregards the testimony of our ancestors. Why are we doing that? I mean, if it was just one culture or two cultures, oh, that's just something that's in the Bible.
Yeah.
See, a lot of people think that the Great Flood is just in the Bible. That couldn't be further from the truth.
Right.
It is everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, there are hundreds of flood myths around the world that correspond to the same.
But they would say that the kind of secularist, modern flatterers of our own time would say, well, the flood myths recur in every civilization ever because it speaks to something within human nature. So it might not have anything to do with a literal historical event, and it almost certainly does not. But there's just something about our nature that makes us imagine these flood myths. I don't think I'm being unfair to them. I think that's actually their point of view.
That's willful ignorance. That's what that is. They know that that's not true.
You give them more credit than I do. I think they're not that smart.
Well, I've talked to, there's the academic who's speaking
ex cathedra.
Yeah, that's right. And then there's the academic who's talking to you, smoking a cigar, having a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Okay, they have their public face, and then they have their private opinions.
Yes, that's right.
And many of these guys privately will admit many things, many interesting things. I've talked to academics and archaeologists and historians. And privately, they'll admit, yeah, there probably was a cataclysm. Yeah. That's not hard to see. And more, they'll admit, many of these guys privately, that giants existed. So not only we have the cataclysm confirmed in the Bible, we also the existence of giants, what are designated as the Nephilim in Genesis 6 and elsewhere in the Old Testament.
So are the giants the ones who built the big megaliths and then stopped cutting at the moment of the cataclysm?
I don't know. See, I think that's a possibility, that some of these edifices perhaps could have been built by giants, but certainly not all of them, simply because of the proportions. There's people out there who are in my community who will say all the megaliths were built by giants. Well, that can't be true, because if you walk through some of the megaliths, they have doorways, and the doorways are, maybe a foot higher than my head, and it's the original doorway, and nobody's going to build a house that they have to crouch down and get into, right? Nobody's going to do that. So if one of these sites was built by giants for giants, then you would expect to see the proportions, right? You would expect to see very large doorways, very large corridors, very large stairwells, and you do at some of them. I'll go back to Sacsayhuaman in Peru. Sacsayhuaman, the doorways are massive. The steps are spread apart so that, let's say they were built like we would build steps, so that's the normal stride of our stature. Yeah. Well, if these stairs were built proportional to the stride of the builders, these are very tall guys. We're talking 9-10 feet tall. So,
but if I go to great cathedrals or even a great symphony hall or something, sometimes they'll have very large doors.
That's a good point. That's true.
So could it just be that?
It could very well just be that. I'm not saying that megaliths were built by giants. It's possible. I don't know who built the megaliths. I don't know who built them. Whoever built them, though, the conventional explanations are inadequate to account for the phenomenon.
So if they were so technologically advanced that we can't even understand how they did what they did, where did the technology go? Who were they? Were they some smarter race of creature? Were they just human beings who figured things out and then generational knowledge was lost? How did it happen?
The knowledge was lost, and the ancients knew it. The ancient Egyptians knew it. The ancient Mesopotamians knew it. They knew it. They knew that the civilizations that had pre-existed them. Specifically, the civilizations from before the Great Cataclysm, from before the flood, were superior to their own. They acknowledged them as such. And this is what I'm trying to illustrate, is all over the world you have the fingerprints in the megaliths, you have the fingerprints of an advanced lost civilization, and it's ubiquitous. Cyclopean architecture is ubiquitous all over the earth. It's not that the Inca over here developed their, megalith building technique and the guys who built Baalbek developed a different one. No, it's the same. It's the same Cyclopean architecture. They're working with the same knowledge.
You've used the word multiple times. Forgive my ignorance. Cyclopean like the Cyclops?
Like the Cyclops.
So was it a race of Cyclops?
This is an archaeological term, and interestingly enough, the Cyclopes were the offspring of the gods in Greek mythology. They were demigods. Yeah. And so the Greeks attributed the megalithic constructions that they saw strewn around the land, but in a state of ruination, they attributed those constructions to the Cyclopes, to the offspring of the gods, because the Cyclops in Greek mythology was the master builder. It was the Cyclops, for example, who forged the thunderbolts of Zeus. I mean, these were the master builders, and I think that's a myth. I'm not saying that the walls were built by actual Cyclopes, but I think it's...
You're just saying, you're using an archaeological term.
It's an archaeological term.
You're using it in a literal way, and in a way that the ancients might have used it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So
the ancients that we think of as the ancients.
If you ask the ancients... Okay, I keep going back to Peru because I lived there for 10 years and I have so much experience there, but if you ask a Quechua person, and the Quechuan people are the native people who live in the Andes. If you ask a Quechua person, one who hasn't been modernized, one who still keeps the old ways and the old traditions, who built these walls?
Yeah.
Sacsayhuaman. Who built those walls? You know what they'll tell you? An ancient race of giants who existed in the world before a flood. That's what they'll tell you. And you'll find the same answer all around the world when you talk to the people and when you inform yourselves of the traditions of the people who live there. And that doesn't mean that all the traditions of these cultures are true. No, there's a lot of mythology. But mythology is designed to convey scientific information.
Yes, it reminds me of one of my absolute favorite books by Owen Barfield, one of the Inklings, actually the Inkling who probably was most responsible for converting C.S. Lewis to Christianity. Owen Barfield, in Poetic Diction, says that we have this modern view that language goes from being prosaic and literal to being figurative and poetic. That's how we but actually it's the opposite. That early primordial language is poetic. And the first example he uses is pneuma, the spirit or the breath, and that actually all those meanings are just collapsed into this one word, pneuma, and it has poetic meaning, it has spiritual reality, it has literal reality, and as language develops and people become more self-conscious, I suppose, the language loses its poetry and becomes more prosaic. And he said, that's lost. It's not that we're going to get back to that. He said, but the echo of that, the last kind of hint, whisper that we have of it, are the myths. That the myths are this kind of, which is not to say that one takes the myths literally, it's just that is the way to convey an early kind of melding of meaning and literal reality.
I agree with that, but I would say it's even more than that. I would say that the myths were crafted by the adepts of the mystery schools, and that these were very learned men, and that they understood things about the universe and about the earth, things that we would equate to modern science, and that they encrypted that knowledge in the myth. So that the myth is like, much like prophetic content from the Bible.
Yeah.
It's like an encrypted folder. So if I'm going to send you a folder with information that I want to conceal, that requires decryption for you to view, I'm going to send you a zipped folder.
Yeah.
And you're going to take that zipped folder onto your computer, and you have to decrypt that folder. You have to unzip it in order to extract the contents. So a myth is like the folder. A myth is that folder with its title, and you kind of have an idea of what it's about. And for the lay people, for who the mystery school adepts would describe as the profane.
Yeah, yeah.
who the occult would describe as the profane.
The hoi polloi.
Yeah. They're not the initiated, like, they're initiated, we're profane. That's how they would see us. We think of these stories, these myths and legends in a different way than they think of them. They know how to decrypt the myths and extract the knowledge.
Well, this would be a divergence probably between your view and the Inklings.
Yeah.
I think especially of Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings, who said, he didn't really like allegory. There's a difference between an allegory. He hated allegory.
Yeah.
Because allegory is like Pilgrim's Progress, just big walking symbols.
Like the Chronicles of Narnia.
The Chronicle, right, yeah. Lewis is probably less talented at his fiction than Tolkien was. Tolkien created myth, though. And so, I guess, not to speak for Tolkien, one of the great writers of the 20th century, but the Tolkien view of myth, and maybe the Inkling view of myth, is that it's not that it's hidden knowledge exactly, it's just it is conveying in the best possible way knowledge that is not really susceptible to prosaic literal speech. Whereas there are also other schools. I'm thinking of in the 20th century a writer like Leo Strauss or other people who write in an esoteric or even Gnostic tradition who say, no, this is about encryption. This is persecution in the art of writing. At all times, the philosophers, the sages, are under attack by the unwashed and the tyrants and the barbarians. And so we need to keep secret from these unwashed masses these ancient truths that will pass on down the generation. That's your view.
That I believe that's absolutely true. And it's not just my view. One Isaac Newton also believed that.
Newton was, because we think of Newton as a natural scientist, but he spent a lot of time, especially in the later part of his career, in alchemy.
He was an alchemist.
And in
a successful
exegesis.
alchemist, by the way.
I knew he was into alchemy. I didn't know he was successful at it.
And I don't know all the details. And every time I try and recount this, I get the details wrong. But let's just say, generally speaking, he was into alchemy. And he believed, as did some of his predecessors, that the myths encapsulated real scientific information, alchemaic recipes, from which you could extract different kinds of elements.
Yeah.
And he performed some of these, he read the recipes, so to speak, from the myths, in a couple of these myths, and he was successful in extracting the element that was theorized that you would get if you did that with the myth, if you read the recipe correct. But myths also encapsulate, more than anything else, astronomical information, and that, there's no question about that. I mean, you look at the ancient world and you see, for example, you look at ancient Egypt and you see all kinds of composite beings, like the Sphinx.
Right.
The Sphinx is a great example. And you have the Sphinx, which I believe originally, the Sphinx was the head of a woman in the body of a lion.
Yeah.
And I have to give credit to the late David Flynn for much of this. I read a book, the most consequential book I've ever read in my life. It's called Sidonia, The Secret Chronicles of Mars, by the late David Flynn. He passed away in 2012. But the Sphinx is actually that composite being, the head of the woman in the body of the lion. Today it's the head of a man, but it's not proportional. The head is small. It appears to have been recarved. I think originally it was the head of a woman, because I believe what the Sphinx is marking is the exact period in time when the cataclysm of the flood occurred. And that happened between the transition of, and we're talking about the zodiac here, because this is how the ancients calculated time. It was the great mill in the sky. It was the celestial timepiece.
Yeah.
Zodiac, ubiquitous in many different cultures around the world, same figures. And that transition from the age of, the transition from the age of Virgo to the age of Leo, when the cataclysm, I'm talking about the cataclysm as described in the Bible, occurred. It ensued during that transitional period between Virgo and Leo. And what is the zodiacal sign for Virgo? The glyph is a woman. And what's the glyph for Leo? A lion. So you have the head of a woman and the body of a lion. It's a time marker.
Right.
So I believe that, and there's other astronomical phenomena that solidifies this idea that the Sphinx is a time marker. But it's marking the age in which it was built, but it's also marking the occurrence of the cataclysm.
So when would that have been? Is that at the historically, academically accepted time, or is that some earlier time? When do you peg
It would be
the Sphinx?
it is a historical time that academics do acknowledge are increasingly acknowledging that was a time of potential cataclysm on Earth. They call that the Younger Dryas period, the end of the last ice age. It's not it's not a time frame that most Christians are accustomed to thinking about in regard to the flood, because it's somewhere around 10,500 BC.
And why?
Somewhere in the neighborhood.
And so you're saying Christians who take a young Earth creation view don't like
Right.
that? Okay.
I'm not a young Earth creationist.
Yeah, I'm a Catholic. We're not too hardcore about any of those particular things, you know.
I believe that the Great Flood of biblical fame happened sometime in the neighborhood. When I say in the neighborhood, give or take 1,000 years. Sometime in the neighborhood of 10,000 BC.
Yeah, it's funny because I do know some of our Protestant friends and viewers are very particular about the Earth is exactly this old, and I'm open to the possibility, but also the tradition going back to the ancients, our ancients, not the super ancients who were earlier, doesn't insist upon a literal historical reading of the book of Genesis. Yeah.
Certainly not. And what's interesting is we talked in the beginning about how all of this conversation for me is framed within the biblical narrative, not because it has to be, but because it simply is. You don't have to read this into the narrative. It is already incorporated into the narrative. What do I mean by that? Well, this period of time, the antediluvian world was considered, again, almost universally by the primary ancient cultures around the world as the Golden Age. Of course, this is a term that comes from the Greeks, and they all have their own terms for it. For example, the ancient Egyptians referred to it as Zep-Tepi, the first time. It's the same thing. It's the same idea. So what is the Golden Age? What is the first time? Yeah. This is the time when the gods descended from heaven and co-inhabited the earth with mankind. And furthermore, copulated with human women and progenerated hybrid offspring.
So I'm thinking now, we were just talking about the book of Genesis 6.
Genesis 6.
A confusing passage where the church fathers are somewhat divided on it. You know, one explanation of Genesis 6, the sons of God looked on the daughters of men and found them to be beautiful and went and did the thing that men and women do. That one reading of that is it's demons or something. Angels or demons mating with human beings.
Yeah.
Now, one issue with that, of course, is that to make a human being in the ordinary course of things, you need two people that have bodies, not an incorporeal being and a corporeal being. However, this is, I think, Justin Martyr in the Second Apology says that it's angels and humans.
That's right.
Though there is some
Tertullian,
and really a number of church fathers, early Christian
Origen.
fathers. Yeah. Now, but there is some disagreement. The one view is the Sethite view, that the sons of God refer to the descendants of Seth, and the daughters of man refer to the descendants of Cain. And then if you were to take an even more metaphorical and symbolic view, it's this notion that virtuous men are seduced by not-so-virtuous women, which is an anthropological fact of history. But your view is...
Oh, you've covered the bases there. So I would say the biblical view, and the only one that makes logical sense, is that the sons of God in Genesis 6 are an angelic faction. These are angels. These are not men. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were comely, and they decided to take wives from among the daughters of men, and they copulated with them, and the production of their union was giants, the Nephilim. See, that story that's found in Genesis 6, the writer of Genesis, when he's writing about the sons of God and this affair, and it's just a little snippet. He does not elaborate. He doesn't enlarge on this strange digression in the Genesis narrative. He just mentions this bizarre thing.
You know, I've started to read the Bible since I was a kid. I want to read the whole Bible, but I wouldn't finish it often. So I would start it again eventually. I'd say, okay, I'm going to start it again. So I've read the book of Genesis like 1 billion times or something. And, you know, every time you get to that and you say, wait, what? Hold on.
Exactly.
What was that part about? Hold on.
That's right. Back up. We need an elaboration on that. Well, the thing is that I'm totally persuaded that the writer of Genesis, as he's writing about the sons of God, this bizarre affair, he's not elaborating on it because the story is already well known. He's just assuming He's assuming that the audience already knows what he's talking about because this was one of the most monumental events that's ever happened.
Even you see this in the New Testament when specific people who were either alive at the time of the writing or who had been alive within living memory. They'll say, yeah, you know, so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so or the son of so-and-so, yeah, he saw this happen, and here's just a little bit, you know, anyway, we all know, right?
Exactly.
You all know Johnny, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so you're saying that this is happening in the book of Genesis, like, yeah, of course, we all know
saying
about
that the writer of Genesis is assuming that that his audience is conversant with the larger narrative that expands on that, on the mention of the sons of God, on the writer of Genesis' allusion to that story. The audience already knew the whole story, so he didn't have to repeat it. There was no need to go back into all the details.
Now, two questions then. One, how does, at least the traditional Christian understanding of what an angel is, which I'm persuaded by, is that an angel is incorporeal. And one can go further, you know, St. Thomas Aquinas describes angels as being, in a way, unique species that are, we have choirs of angels, we have different hierarchy of angels, but they don't communicate by speaking, for instance, because they don't have vocal cords and mouths. Now, angels do interact with human beings in mystical and interesting ways, but angels in themselves don't have bodies. Human beings do have bodies and rational souls. So we have intellect and we have flesh and we have will. And then there are the lower animals who have bodies and they have instinct and they have appetite, but they don't have intellect and will. So we're kind of this middle ground. We've got the reason, the intellect and the will, albeit greatly degraded, of an angel, but we got the body of an animal, and we're kind of this meeting point. So how does an incorporeal being create a child with a corporeal being, or do you have a different view of angels?
I think we need to back up a little bit because we have to deal with what I call the first cause. So let's assume for a moment that Genesis 6 is angels, and they're looking down at the daughters of men, and they're lusting after them.
Yeah.
They're desiring to take them as wives and to copulate with them, to have intercourse with them.
Yeah.
So what's the first cause here? Lust.
Yeah.
In fact, when I was talking about the elaboration of that story, why the writer of Genesis didn't bother to elaborate on it, is because it was well known to the ancient Hebrews.
Yeah.
In the book of Enoch, which was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The book of Enoch is actually quoted verbatim in the New Testament, in the book of Jude, verbatim.
Right. So it's considered an apocryphal book or non-canonical book. It's not included in any canon of the Bible that we're familiar with. Certainly not in the history of the church, making, you know, ecumenical council formal decrees. But it has been around.
Except for in Ethiopia.
Ethiopia.
In Ethiopia, both the Beta Israel Jews, the ancient Jewish community, and the Tawahedo Orthodox Christians long ago incorporated and preserved the Book of Enoch in their canon.
And as you say, there are references, it would seem, in the New Testament. So
Many.
what is, I didn't know
There are allusions. There are many allusions to the Book of Enoch. For example, when Jesus says, in my Father's house are many mansions. Well, where's that come from? The Book of Enoch.
Book of
It's
Enoch.
nowhere to be found.
I don't know,
in
I've
the Old
never read the
Testament.
Book of Enoch.
There are many allusions, but then, as I said, in Jude, it's verbatim. And Jude says that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, and then copy, paste. Copy from First Enoch, paste into his epistle. So they were conversant. The early church, the church fathers, the disciples of Christ, Christ himself, and all of the writers of the Bible, all of them were conversant with the Book of Enoch. There's no question. In fact, I believe that if you were living in first century Jerusalem, before it was destroyed by the Romans, and if you were to walk into the temple during the time of Christ, into the synagogue, I think you would find in the scriptorium, where all of the sacred scrolls are kept, you would find a manuscript that was representative of what today we call First Enoch, Ethiopic Enoch.
I would even say, as someone who is totally innocent of the Book of Enoch, I've never read it, I have no strong opinions of whether it was some huge mistake not to include it in the canon. I don't think there are mistakes in the canon.
And I'm not arguing that it was, by the way.
Exactly. My view is, I think that the Proto-Evangelium of James, for instance, is an edifying work to read and can inform us. It's useful. Maybe it's not canon, but it's useful. And so that seems to be kind of the view that you're taking.
Well, I will say this, and that is my view, but I will say this, I'll add. that in the book of Enoch, see, the book of Enoch, first Enoch, is very complex. And we're going to get back to what I called the first cause in a minute with Enoch. But the book of Enoch is very complex. First Enoch, there are 3 different books of Enoch. Only one of them, portions of it, were written before Christ. That's the one I'm interested in, first Enoch. There's second Enoch, which is called the Slavonic Enoch, and third Enoch, which is called the Hebrew Enoch. First Enoch is known as the Ethiopian Enoch because the Ethiopians preserved it. First Enoch, the oldest portions of First Enoch, namely the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Parables, were most certainly written before Christ. And why is this important? Because some of the most extraordinary, astounding, Christological prophecies pertaining to the Son of Man, which is the title that Jesus used most often when speaking of himself, are in the parables in First Enoch. I mean, absolutely stunningly accurate prophecies pertaining to Jesus of Nazareth, written before Christ.
Is there any dispute over the dating of the first book of Enoch?
Most scholars will date, in fact, almost universally, scholars date the earliest portions of Enoch to sometime around 300 BC. Now, there are it's a complicated document because it's a compilation of text written by various authors. I'm most interested in the first 2 sections of First Enoch, which are the Book of the Watchers and the Parables, precisely because they're dated to before the birth of Christ. And my whole point in bringing up Enoch was you have that snippet in Genesis.
Yeah.
Well, that story is elaborated in the Book of Enoch. In fact, that's where the story comes from, is the Book of Enoch. That little reference in Genesis, if you want to know the full story of what the author is alluding to, you read First Enoch, specifically the Book of the Watchers, the first section. And it tells you this extraordinary narrative. I mean, it's what I call the Enochian tale. And about the sons of God, which are designated as watchers in First Enoch, that they're looking down, they're seeing the daughters of men, and it's basically almost copy paste into Genesis, the Genesis 6 reference. And intriguingly enough, in R.H. Charles' translation, it's the same verses, Genesis 6, 1 through whatever it is, 4, I think, the sons of God. But in the Book of Enoch, it's the angels. And by the way, that's the way the Septuagint renders it as well. Genesis 6, the angels are looking down at the daughters of men, that they're fair, that they're beautiful, and they lust. Okay, so that's why I told you to back up. I call that the first cause of the angel's sin in this particular case, the Watcher's rebellion. The first cause is lust. How do you explain lust for spiritual beings who don't have bodies? How do you explain incorporeal beings having sexual impulses?
That is a very good question, but just before we get to it, you wouldn't say this is the first sin that the angels committed, because the rebellion of the angels, the rebellion of Satan, would have had to predate.
This particular incident, this was the catalyst for what they were about to do.
Yeah, so how does an incorporeal being, become tumescent, to use a diplomatic word, or fair-looking ladies on the ground?
That's right. And not only do these angels, according to First Enoch, again, which is the elaboration of the Genesis 6 reference, not only do they lust after these women, they are determined to take them as their wives and procreate offspring with them. Yeah. So they lust, that's the first cause. Yeah. Then they descend to the earth, according to First Enoch. 200 watchers descend to the earth on the summit of Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon's very interesting in the Bible. They descend to the summit of Mount Hermon. They bind themselves by an oath of mutual imprecations. In other words, all for one, one for all. We're all in this together. They knew it was a great sin, but they were going to accept the consequences together, whatever befall. And then that's why by the way, the Mount Hermon has been known since time immemorial as the Mountain of Oath. And then they descended into the plains, and they chose each one woman, one maiden that they desired to wed, who they ultimately took to wife. They copulated with these women. These women conceived and gave birth to giants, demigods, the offspring of God and man. Okay? This is the Hebraic cosmological paradigm of the antediluvian world. This is the Hebraic paradigm of the Golden Age, of Zep Tepi. Because the the ancient Mesopotamians and the ancient Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans and all the rest of them, they believe that the very same thing occurred.
The
that
age
the
of the
gods
heroes, right?
descended to the earth.
Yeah, yeah.
That they copulated with human women. I mean, look at Atlantis, the story of Atlantis. Everybody knows about the city of Atlantis and the legend of Atlantis. But very few people pay attention to what Plato writes in the Timaeus and Critias dialogue, where he talks about Atlantis. He has Solon of Athens traveling to Egypt, and he's being informed by the priest of Sais about the extraordinary past of the Athenians that he's unaware of. And part of this past involves this conflict that they had, this epic conflict with Atlantis and the Atlanteans. And they tell him the whole story, right? And everybody's familiar with Atlantis, that Atlantis was this advanced ancient city.
It's a great resort in the Caribbean.
Right, yeah. That as well, yes. It still exists today.
In a slightly degraded form. Perfectly pleasant.
It does. So that Atlantis was this advanced civilization that was destroyed in a day and a night in cataclysm, right? But Plato has the priest of Sais telling Solon in the dialogue the full story.
Yeah.
And what's the beginning of the story of Atlantis? The beginning of the story of Atlantis is that the gods who descended to the earth are apportioning the earth amongst themselves. They're creating an empire, and they're dividing up their kingdoms. And Poseidon, for his lot, he got the area of Atlantis, the region that would become Atlantis. So what does he do? He builds Atlantis. He raises up an island out of the sea, which is ultimately going to be the home of this city Atlantis. But what does he do after this, or during this? He becomes enamored of a human woman named Cleito, and he takes her as his wife. And he copulates with her. And she gives birth to 5 sets of twin sons who will become the 10 kings of Atlantis. And these are giants. Atlas, for example, he's the chief among them. That's the backstory. So what do we see here? Well, this is a one-to-one match with the book of Enoch in Genesis 6. Is it not? It's the gods descending to the earth, taking human women as their wives, having intercourse with them, and progenerating a race of demigod giants. This is everywhere. Yeah. It's just like the megaliths that we were talking about. This is called the Golden Age. And I believe that it's literally true, that literally happened in the time before the Great Flood. And I believe in the ubiquitous testimony of our ancient ancestors. And in fact, the Egyptians informed Solon. It was in the midst of the conflict because this Atlantean empire became expansionary, they became aggressive, and they were going on conquest, and they were steamrolling everybody that they encountered until they encountered the Athenians, who were the only faction that was able to resist them, and they're locked into this epic war, the Atlanteans versus the Athenians, and then cataclysm. Cataclysm destroys Atlantis and everyone else, not just Atlantis. It's a global cataclysm. And the Egyptians kept record of this, and they told Solon that wasn't the only cataclysm. There have been many cataclysms because they believed it was cyclic.
Right.
That the cataclysm is cyclic. That there's this celestial timepiece, the zodiac, that the primary function of which is to keep track of when the cataclysm is going to occur again. So this is how the ancients viewed. So if you were to, and I'm not saying, by the way, that means that the pyramids were built by giants or anything like that. I don't want people to think that. I don't know who built the Great Pyramids. But I do believe that many of these extraordinary megalithic sites around the world, like Baalbek, were built in the age before the flood. And it had something to do with the knowledge of the gods who descended to the earth. That's what the ancients say. That's what they all say.
All I will contribute to that narrative is one of my most intelligent friends, very well-grounded, extraordinarily educated, very, very high IQ, very serious person, has told me for years now. He says, when I think of these ancient structures, and there are all these debates over how they were built, and I basically think it's largely demons. And he'll say this with a totally straight face. And he means it. He's not joking around. And that kind of sounds like what you're saying.
Well, I'm going to qualm with the term demons a little bit here. So we have a very Western perspective of angels and demons. We have a demonology that comes from Western tradition that is not necessarily concordant with ancient Hebraic cosmology. Because if you were to ask an ancient Hebrew or the writers of the Old Testament what a demon was, they would have a very different answer than us.
Well, if you asked an ancient Greek what daimon,
That's right.
like even the phrase
That's a
for
very good
happiness, right? Eudaimonia.
Yeah,
It's kind of like spirit.
That's a very good point, because the Greeks believed specifically that the daimon was a spirit, a disembodied spirit of a being who had lived in the world before the flood. That's what a daimon was, that they died in the Golden Age, and that their spirits persisted in the earth after the flood in the form of daimons. Well, guess what? That's the Hebraic view. That's the view that's concordant with ancient Hebrew cosmology. So, in the cosmology of the Jews, the demons are a very specific thing. So let's address first how we view demons in Western civilization. And this is, I would say, primarily the product of medieval Christianity.
I'd love to, by the way, before you get into this explanation, I love this point you're making, which is more ambitious and audacious probably than many viewers are even noticing, because there's this idea that we all just accept as a matter of course, that our civilization comes from the melding of Greece and Jerusalem. And there are these totally different ways of viewing the world with these totally different perspectives. But really, I think it's overly simplistic to suggest that the Greeks had no sense of the Hebraic view, and that the Hebrews had no sense of the Greek view. And come on, guys, it's pretty close together. And you see harmonies and echoes. Yeah, and that's what you're saying. No, actually, there is a kind of unified cosmology.
They're all inheriting the same tradition. Now that tradition is becoming variegated. It's taking on the idiosyncrasies of these particular cultures as they develop. But there's a source. The answer is it's because there's a source of a narrative. There's a source to the narrative of the flood. There's one particular source, and I would say that source is Noah and his sons. And then that story gets taken by the ancient Mesopotamians, the ancient Sumerians, who I think are the civilization that grew out ultimately of Noah and his sons. And then it's changed, the names are changed, people speak different languages, the details get jumbled, and you get these stories that have similar elements, right? They have these foundational elements, the flood myths, but then they have their idiosyncrasies as well. And that's precisely because all of these stories are founded in the same original narrative.
So then what have
the true story.
Right. What have we gotten wrong about demons?
Okay, so going back to that, so the Western perspective of demons is basically we will view demon as anything that is, well, demonic, anything that is scary or grotesque, we would call a demon.
Or even basic, like an angel that rebels, a bad angel.
Or an angel that rebels. We lump all of that together in this term demon. So in the Western mind, a demon is it's like a boogeyman, basically. It's like anything that's evil and malevolent, supernaturalism, that's all demon. That's a demon. But in the ancient Hebrew cosmology, they were much more narrow in their defining of the word demon. To them, a demon was something very, very specific. A demon was the disembodied spirit of a giant. A giant that died in the antediluvian world before the flood. Their spirit, as this is in the book of Enoch, by the way, it derives from the book of Enoch, that their spirit, this is judgment. God judges them that because they're neither wholly of their fathers, their angelic fathers, or of their human mothers, that they're going to be cursed when they die to wander the earth as bodiless vagabonds, as disembodied vagabonds. They're going to be hungry, they're going to be thirsty, presumably they're going to have all the desires of the flesh, but no bodies through which to fulfill those desires, to satiate those desires. That was a curse that was placed on them by God, according to the book of Enoch, according to ancient Hebrew cosmology. This and only this is the origin of a demon and is what a demon is. And so,
but what about like when Lucifer rebels? Satan falls like lightning and leads all the bad angels who rebelled against God, and there's a great battle, and they lose. Spoiler alert! And Saint Michael, the archangel, wins. God wins. He always wins. And what about them?
Well,
that's before the giants.
Those are the insubordinate sons of God. These are the defected sons of God. right? These were the angelic beings who were loyal to the king at one time,
Yeah.
but who rebelled and became disloyal and were expelled. And that's what they are, but that they're not.
You're saying that's distinct from...
They're not technically demons. So the demon is, again, specifically, according to Hebrew cosmology, a demon is specifically the disembodied spirit of Nephilim. Now, when God, in the book of Enoch, again, this is a judgment on the giants, on the offspring of the Watchers. They're sentenced to this terrible curse. You know, it's very much like the plot line of the Pirates of the Caribbean, the first one, right? You had Barbossa and his crew. They had the Mayan gold, the cursed Mayan gold, and they had this curse where they were living forever. They were like eternal, but they couldn't satisfy any of the desires of their flesh. Right. And this is represented, this is illustrated with Barbossa, who wants to bite the apple. But he can't, when he bites it, you know, the moon comes out or something, and you see that he's just a skeleton, and there's nowhere for the food to go. He has no tongue, he has no stomach. And all he wants is to be able to satisfy his hunger, to be able to bite that apple. Well, that perfectly illustrates the nature of a demon according to ancient Hebrew cosmology. So you have the disembodied spirits of the giants that are going to persist in the world as vagabond wraiths. That's their curse, much like the Barbossa and his crew's curse. They're gonna wander the earth, hungry, thirsty, presumably all of the desires of the flesh, but with no flesh through which to fulfill those desires, to satiate those desires. That's a very torturous existence. So fast forward to the New Testament, I should say, before I go there, and a part of this curse, God tells them that they'll be in this condition until the end of the age, when the age is wholly consummated and the great judge appears. And at that time, they will be judged with finality, right? But until that time, they're going to be cursed to wander the earth in this miserable state. So fast forward to the New Testament. Jesus is walking in Galilee. Jesus is walking all over Judea. And what is he encountering? He's encountering these things called unclean spirits. And going back to the Enochian reference, part of the judgment was God says, evil spirits or unclean spirits you shall be called. Fast forward to the New Testament. Jesus is encountering unclean spirits. And what are these spirits doing? They're inhabiting the bodies of human beings. And when they get inside the body of a human being, it manifests something like epilepsy. That the person is rolling around, foaming from the mouth, throwing themselves into the fire, screaming at the top of their lungs. And Jesus would cast these demons out, and they were called unclean spirits. And there's a particular occasion when Jesus is walking on the shores of Gadara, and this is the Gadarene demoniac encounter, where the Gadarene demoniac comes running up to Jesus, and he's full of a legion of demons. I mean, he's full of all kinds of demons, right?
He had his pronouns were the plural pronouns.
It was they, them.
Modern analogy.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely right. He was they, them. And he throws himself at the feet of Jesus. He sees him coming, and he throws himself at the feet of Jesus, and the demons cry out, "What have we to do with you, O Son of God? We know who you are, you Son of God. Why have you come to judge us before the appointed time?"
Right.
So what do we have here? We have a confirmation of the book of Enoch. Because the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, they have no bodies of their own, so what do they want? They want bodies. So they're inhabiting the bodies of human beings, and through the bodies of the people that they possess, they're attempting to satiate these desires that they have, which are otherwise insatiable. And they see who walking on the shore of Gadara? The great judge. But wait a minute, it's not time yet, according to the book of Enoch. It's not the end of the age yet. That's why they cry out, "What have we to do with you? Why have you come to judge us before the appointed time?" The time had not yet come, and they knew it. So there's a confirmation of that cosmology that comes from First Enoch in this encounter that Jesus has with the Gadarene demoniac, who is a human being possessed by disembodied spirits. So that's the very narrow definition of what a demon is. And as I illustrated before, it's the same idea to the Greeks. As I said, they believe that the daimons, the daimones, or however you pronounce it in Greek, are disembodied spirits from people who lived in the world before the flood in the Golden Age. It's the same. It's basically the same tradition.